She was crowned queen before she could write her name. At 9, she wore a crown. At 16, she wore shackles. In a world of men and monarchs, she was a girl trapped in silk and blood. And when her enemies could no longer control her, they silenced her, not with war but with a sword. On December 14, 1542, the wails of a newborn echoed through Linlithgow Palace. That infant, Mary Stuart, entered the world just 6 days before her destiny devoured her childhood. Her father, King James V of Scotland, lay dying at Falkland Palace, humiliated by his military defeat at the hands of the English, with no surviving sons. The Scottish crown passed not to a battle-hardened noble, but to a girl too small to hold it. Scotland had a queen. She was 6 days old. James V's alleged final words, "It came wi alas, it will gang wi alas," were more than bitter poetry. They were a prophecy. His crown had passed from a woman, his own mother Margaret Tudor, and now to another. And many feared Mary would be the last. Her coronation at 9 months old was less a celebration and more a desperate attempt to preserve national unity. Surrounded by feuding clans and foreign threats, Scottish nobles knew they were placing the future in the hands of an infant who couldn't speak, let alone rule. But there was no other option. The ceremonies at Stirling Castle were steeped in tradition, but beneath the hymns and incense lay panicked. Her mother, Mary of Guise, a French noblewoman and devout Catholic, took control as regent, but she governed a fractured realm, England's. Henry VIII, sensing weakness, launched an aggressive courtship cloaked in warfare. He proposed a union between young Mary and his son Edward. When the Scots refused, the rough wooing began a campaign of brutal raids meant to batter Scotland into submission. By the time Mary was 5, her homeland had become a battlefield. Her earliest memories were likely the sound of prayers muttered during sieges and the smell of smoke from burning villages. She was a queen in name, but a prisoner of politics. The Scottish court, under siege and terrified of her being captured, made a decision that would shape the rest of her life. Exiled in 1548. At just 5 years old, Mary was sent across the sea to France, a move portrayed as a diplomatic alliance, but, in truth, a desperate escape. The French promised her safety and a future marriage to the Dauphin Francis. In return, France gained unprecedented influence over Scotland. The Queen of Scots would be raised as a daughter of France. As the ship pulled away from Scottish shores, those left behind wept for their queen, for their country, and for the coming war they knew they would face without her. Few could have imagined it would be over a decade before she would return, and by then, neither she nor Scotland would be the same. France would shape her smile, her faith, her charm, and dull her sense of danger, because across the Channel, while Mary was learning to dance in Versailles Gardens, her enemies in Scotland were learning how to kill queens. France did not simply receive Mary Stuart, it absorbed her. At 5 years old, she was no longer just a Scottish queen in exile. She became the gleaming pearl of the French court, promised in marriage to the Dauphin, Francis, and raised among the most powerful dynasties in Europe. From the moment she arrived, she was enveloped in silk, song, and scrutiny. Her new guardians, the Guise family, her mother's powerful relatives, ensured she was molded into the ideal Catholic queen. She studied Latin, Greek, philosophy, and scripture. She learned to dance, compose poetry, and wield conversation like a blade. At the French court, Mary outshone most. Her height, elegance, auburn hair, and quick wit made her a favorite among nobles. But beneath the gold and perfume, Mary was being polished not for herself, but for power. She had been brought to France to marry the future king and unify Scotland and France under a shared Catholic banner. But to the French monarchy, Mary was more than a queen of a far-off, windswept kingdom. Thanks to her Tudor blood through her grandmother Margaret, Mary also carried a legitimate claim to the English throne, especially in the eyes of Catholics, who viewed Elizabeth I's rule as heretical and illegitimate. That claim would make Mary both revered and feared, and would paint a target on her back for the rest of her life. In 1558, at age 15, Mary married Francis, the delicate and sickly Dauphin. The wedding, held at Notre Dame, was nothing short of a spectacle. It united not just two people, but 3 crowns, Scotland, France, and potentially England. For a brief moment, it seemed Mary Stuart stood on the edge of an empire. But power gained too quickly often slips through trembling fingers. Just a year later, King Henry II died from a jousting injury, and Francis ascended the throne. Mary became Queen of France at 16. But Francis's reign was short-lived, frail, withdrawn, and frequently ill. He could not bear the weight of a kingdom. Within months, real power slipped into the hands of the Guises, Mary's own uncles, whose extremism sparked outrage and chaos in a France already buckling under the tensions of religious division. Then, in December of 1560, Francis died of a lingering ear infection that turned septic. Mary, still only 17, was left a widow, childless, and politically adrift. She had lost her crown, her protector, and her place in the French succession. With the rise of her brother-in-law Charles IX and his mother Catherine de' Medicis' iron grip on the regency, Mary became politically expendable. The court that had once dressed her in gold now looked away when she passed. France had no more use for the Queen of Scots, and so Mary made a decision few expected. She would return to Scotland. But the country she left as a child was no longer hers. The Protestant Reformation had torn through it like wildfire. Her mother, Mary of Guise, had died. Her enemies had grown bold. Her crown was intact, but the throne beneath it was crumbling. She would not return to admiration, but to suspicion. Not to welcome, but to warn. She was Catholic in a land that now burned priests, French in a court that distrusted every accent, royal in name but dangerously alone. Still, she returned, because queens do not retreat. And Mary had one more crown in sight, but waiting for her in Edinburgh were letters, spies, and sermons, each one sharpening the knives that would one day surround her neck. The ship that brought Mary Stuart back to Scotland in August of 1561 glided through fog and salt air, not with ceremony, but with caution. At 18, she returned not as a triumphant monarch, but as a Catholic queen in a Protestant land, widowed, childless, and surrounded by men who viewed her as either a threat or a pawn. The Edinburgh she stepped into was colder than she remembered. The streets were darker, the people are more guarded. Bells did not ring for her return. The reformers, led by the thunderous voice of John Knox, had filled the pulpits with warnings of her rival. He called her Jezebel in a velvet gown, an agent of Rome, a temptress sent to corrupt the soul of the nation, and the people listened. Yet Mary carried herself with poise sharpened by the French court. She held daily mass behind closed doors, a quiet defiance of the rising Protestant orthodoxy. She wrote letters with grace, spoke with diplomacy, and held court with elegance. But beneath the silk and smiles, she faced a kingdom that had slipped out of her hands. The nobles had carved up power in her absence. Her half-brother, James Stuart, now Earl of Moray, acted as her advisor but aligned himself with the reformers. Others sought only to manipulate her, to marry into power, or to pull her into their vendettas. The very lords who had once protected her crown in infancy now plotted behind her back, weighing the benefit of keeping her alive against the chaos her bloodline might invite. And still, Mary tried. She tried to unify her people, to govern with tolerance, allowing Protestant preachers to speak freely while maintaining her Catholic devotion. She toured the kingdom, made gestures of peace, and even reached out diplomatically to Elizabeth I of England in hopes of recognition as her heir. But the English queen saw more than charm. She saw a rival. Elizabeth viewed Mary's claim to the English throne, reinforced by papal recognition, as a ticking bomb. To acknowledge her as an heir was to hand a sword to the enemy. And so Mary received polite letters, but no promises, smiles but no security. Time passed, pressure mounted, and then came the question that would shatter the fragile peace she had tried to build: marriage. She needed an heir to secure her bloodline, and Scotland demanded stability through a royal consort. Suitors lined up: foreign princes, English nobles, but Mary made a choice that shocked both courts and clergy. She married Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. He was handsome, charming, and like Mary, descended from Margaret Tudor, giving their potential child an even stronger claim to the English throne. But he was also arrogant, unstable, and deeply insecure. Within weeks of their marriage in 1565, his thirst for power erupted. He demanded the crown matrimonial, which would have made him co-sovereign. Mary refused. Darnley sulked, drank, and conspired. As Mary grew pregnant with his child, her court descended into paranoia. Darnley surrounded himself with enemies of the Queen and, in a display of brutality that shattered her already fragile rule, helped orchestrate the murder of her trusted secretary, David Rizzio. Rizzio was dragged from Mary's chambers and stabbed over 50 times, his blood soaking the floor just feet from the pregnant Queen's skirts. Scotland now whispered that its Queen was surrounded by vipers. The nobles sharpened their suspicions, and Elizabeth of England watched with quiet satisfaction as Mary's golden image darkened still. Mary gave birth to a son, James, a prince who could someday unite Scotland and England under one crown. But peace was slipping through her fingers, because the man she married to protect her throne would soon be found strangled and blown apart. His murder the first in a chain of horrors that would seal her fate forever. On the frozen morning of February 10, 1567, a house outside Edinburgh exploded with such force that nearby windows shattered and chimneys cracked. The structure was reduced to rubble. But what stunned investigators was not the ruin, but the body. They found lying undisturbed in the garden, untouched by the flames. It was Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, Mary's husband and the father of her son. His corpse bore no burns, only strangulation marks and the scent of betrayal. The murder of Darnley shocked the realm. Scotland reeled at the spectacle, a king consort murdered in the night, his body dumped like refuse, and his wife Scotland's queen eerily silent in the days that followed. Rumors spread like wildfire. Had Mary ordered it? Had she known? Or worse, had she chosen to protect the real killer? The official inquiry was a farce. Nobles who might have been involved sat on the investigation panel. Witnesses vanished. Evidence was ignored. And through it all, one name rose above the rest: James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell. Bothwell was everything Darnley was not: rugged, military-trained, politically savvy, and deeply ambitious. He had long been close to Mary, serving as her protector and confidant. But after Darnley's murder, he stepped from the shadows. Weeks after the explosion, he was tried for the crime and acquitted in a single day with no testimony presented. It was a performance, not a trial, and Scotland watched with grim understanding. Then came the moment that broke whatever support Mary still held. 3 months after Darnley's death, Mary was abducted on the road to Edinburgh by Bothwell and his men. Whether it was a genuine kidnapping or a planned maneuver remains debated. But what happened afterward is not. She was taken to Dunbar Castle, held for days, and emerged married to her husband's suspected murderer. The nation recoiled. Nobles, who had tolerated Mary's French ways, her Catholicism, even her royal pride, now viewed her as compromised, if not corrupted. The marriage to Bothwell confirmed their darkest suspicions. Whether she had been coerced or complicit no longer mattered. The crown no longer protected her. It condemned her. Rebellion followed swiftly. Just weeks after the marriage, a confederation of Scottish lords raised arms. They called themselves the Confederate Lords, and they were done waiting. They branded Bothwell a murderer and Mary a traitor. Their army surged toward Edinburgh. Mary and Bothwell met them at Carberry Hill, but no battle came. Her forces withered. Nobles deserted, and Mary, standing beside a man her people loathed, was left alone in the summer heat. She surrendered under the promise of safe conduct. But promises to queens mean little once crowns crack. Bothwell fled into exile. Mary was taken prisoner. The young queen who had once ruled from French palaces and Scottish halls now found herself locked in a tower, her banners torn down, her son ripped from her arms. James, barely a year old, was declared king. Her half-brother, the Earl of Moray, assumed regency. The throne she had sacrificed everything to preserve now sat beneath someone else's name or still. Even in chains, Mary's story wasn't over, because queens may be caged but they are never quiet. And inside the stone walls of Loch Leven Castle, Mary began to plan the impossible: escape. What followed would be her most daring move yet, an act that would either reclaim her crown or end her life with steel. Locked away inside the cold stone walls of Loch Leven Castle, Mary Stuart was not just a prisoner, she was a symbol. The Confederate lords thought the Queen broken, her crown stripped, her legacy destroyed. But Mary had not forgotten who she was. Queens do not fade. They plan. Her imprisonment, though humiliating, had not shattered her will. She wrote letters in secret, smuggled messages through loyal servants, and watched closely for a crack in the walls not just of the castle, but of her captor's confidence. And that crack came unexpectedly. Through a teenage boy, George Douglas, the brother of her jailer, became entranced by Mary's grace, charm, and sorrow. Whether it was love, loyalty, or youthful delusion, he agreed to help her. With his aid and the complicity of a disguised page boy, Mary escaped through a small postern gate, boarded a waiting boat, and crossed the loch under moonlight. It was May 2nd, 1568. The Queen of Scots was free. But freedom, it turned out, meant nothing without power. Mary gathered a small army of loyal nobles and rallied her banner at Langside, hoping to reclaim the throne and undo the damage of her disastrous marriage and Bothwell's flight. She believed Scotland would rise for her, that the people would remember the Queen behind the scandal. But the battle was short and brutal. Her forces were outmaneuvered and crushed by the Regent Moray's army. The dream of restoration died in the smoke and blood of a single morning. Mary fled, not to another castle, but across the border into England. It was a desperate decision and one she would regret for the rest of her life. She believed Elizabeth I, her cousin, her fellow queen, would shelter her, that she would be treated as royalty, not a fugitive. But Elizabeth saw something else entirely, a dangerous rival who had already caused chaos in one kingdom and might do the same in another. Mary was intercepted by English officials and taken into custody, not imprisoned in a dungeon, but caged in comfort, her rooms well furnished, her meals prepared, but every word she spoke, every letter she wrote, was watched. She was no longer queen, she was bait, a living symbol for every Catholic rebellion that threatened Elizabeth's Protestant reign, and she couldn't help herself. She wrote to kings, whispered to courtiers, and signed her name to promises that would haunt her. In Elizabeth's court, Mary's presence was like a knife in the dark. The Privy Council feared her, the Protestant elite hated her, and still, she smiled and waited. Because she believed that one day, someone would come for her. And someone did. A conspiracy was forming, one that promised liberation and vengeance. A plot that involved letters, assassins, and the hope of placing Mary not just back on the Scottish throne, but on England's as well. What Mary didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that every word she wrote in support of that plot was being copied, decoded, and delivered straight to Elizabeth's spymaster. The stage was nearly set for the final act. And this time, the crown would not be stolen but shattered forever beneath a block of English oak. Mary Stuart had always known the power of ink. Her letters had stirred kings, soothed enemies, and seduced allies. But in captivity, her pen became her noose. For nearly 19 years, Mary remained imprisoned across a series of English castles and manors. Though treated with noble courtesy, fine gowns, servants, and meals, her every move was watched, every visitor vetted, every note intercepted. Elizabeth I, cautious and calculating, refused to meet her cousin face to face, yet also refused to release or execute her. Mary became a problem that could not be solved until she tried to solve it herself. Enter the Babington plot. In 1586, Mary began secretly corresponding with a young Catholic nobleman named Anthony Babington. Through a system of hidden messages smuggled in beer barrels and coded by cipher, Mary encouraged a conspiracy that would end Elizabeth's reign. The plot's goal: assassinate the Queen of England, rescue Mary from captivity, and place her on the throne as the rightful Catholic monarch of England. Mary's letters were hopeful, desperate, and explicit. She approved of the plan. She urged caution. She even discussed the timing. What she didn't know was that her secret letters were being read the moment they were written. Sir Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's spymaster, had built a network of codebreakers, double agents, and interceptors so vast it rivaled modern intelligence agencies. He had already allowed parts of the plot to unfold, deliberately keeping Mary under surveillance so her own words could be used to seal her fate. Once the letter arrived bearing her approval of Elizabeth's assassination, Walsingham had what he needed. The net snapped shut. Babington and the other conspirators were arrested, tortured, and executed, hanged, drawn, and quartered in the public squares of London. Their deaths were loud. Mary's would be quieter, but just as brutal. Elizabeth hesitated. Executing a queen, especially one with royal blood and international support, was dangerous. But the pressure from her counselors, Parliament, and Protestant factions was overwhelming. Mary had crossed a line that even family could not excuse. In October 1586, Mary was put on trial at Fotheringhay Castle. She was denied legal counsel. She was not allowed to see the evidence in full, but she defended herself with elegance and fury, declaring that she had been entrapped, that the letters were forgeries, and that she was being punished not for treason, but for who she was, a Catholic, a queen, a threat. The trial ended in condemnation. Elizabeth delayed the sentence, hoping for a miracle or perhaps for the problem to vanish. But time offered no escape. On February 1, 1587, Elizabeth finally signed the death warrant. She later claimed she never meant for it to be carried out, but her signature held the weight of a crown. Mary's final days were a mixture of sorrow and resolve. She dressed in crimson, the color of martyrdom, and wrote farewell letters to her family and allies. She forgave her enemies. She prepared her soul. And on February 8, 1587, the girl who had once been crowned in silk was led to the block in linen. But the execution would not be clean, because even death, it seemed, refused to show Mary Stuart mercy. The morning of February 8, 1587, was bitterly cold. Inside the great hall of Fotheringhay Castle, a wooden scaffold had been hastily constructed. The air hung heavy with dread as guards led Mary Stuart, now 44 years old, into the chamber where history would end her life. She wore crimson beneath her black mourning cloak, the color of Catholic martyrdom. Her steps were steady. Her eyes were unflinching. If the court had hoped to see a broken woman, they were mistaken. Mary carried herself not like a criminal, but like a queen who understood that her death would outlive her. She knelt before the block and offered her final prayers aloud in Latin. She forgave her executioners. She spoke not of rebellion or revenge, but of faith. The crowd was silent. Then the executioner raised his axe. The first blow struck the back of her head. She did not die. The second blow cut deeper, but still did not sever. Only on the third swing was her head fully taken, but even then, her dignity was defiled. When the executioner lifted her head to the crowd and cried, "God save the Queen," her auburn wig came away in his hand. Her head dropped, revealing short, gray hair underneath a final humiliation. She had prepared even her death with theatrical precision, and still, the world pulled off her mask. Then, from under her skirts, her small dog emerged, trembling, soaked in her blood. The sight broke even the hardest faces in the chamber. Word of the execution spread with speed and fury. In England, shock rippled through the court. Elizabeth, when informed, reportedly locked herself away and wept, claiming she had never meant for the warrant to be carried out. Some say her remorse was genuine. Others say it was performance, another stage in a reign built on strategy. Across Europe, outrage exploded. Mary had long been seen by Catholic monarchs as a symbol of resistance to Protestant rule. Her death was not just an execution, it was an assassination of a queen by another. Spain, already plotting revenge against Elizabeth, accelerated its plans. The Spanish Armada would sail the following year, in part fueled by Mary's blood. But no vengeance would bring her back. Mary Stuart was buried first at Peterborough Cathedral, denied the royal honors she deserved, but her story did not end in that grave. Years later, her son James, now King of England and Scotland, had her remains moved to Westminster Abbey, placing her near the very cousin who had signed her death warrant. That it was not forgiveness, it was reclamation. The child she bore in scandal, raised apart from her, had now inherited both her kingdoms. Her bloodline had outlasted the politics that destroyed her. Yet her legacy remains divided. To some, she was reckless, a queen who allowed passion and pride to unravel her reign. To others, she was a martyr, a woman crushed beneath the weight of crowns she never asked to wear, silenced by fear, faith, and fate. But no matter which side of history you choose, One truth remains unshakable: they took her head, but they never took her voice, because long after the blade fell, the name Mary, Queen of Scots, still echoed across courts, cathedrals, and centuries. And in that silence, England learned a lesson it would never forget: kings may rule with swords, but queens die with stories. Mary Stuart died in 1587, but her story did not die in many ways. Her true reign began after the blade struck. Her blood soaked the scaffold, but it also carved a path into legend and into power. For the child she bore, James VI of Scotland, would become the very figure neither Mary nor Elizabeth could ever fully be, a ruler of both Scotland and England. In 1603, after Elizabeth I died childless, James inherited the English throne as James I, uniting the crowns that had been at war for generations. Ironically, the Catholic Queen Elizabeth feared most give birth to the Protestant king who would carry her legacy forward. The irony didn't end there. Mary had spent her life fighting to be recognized as the rightful successor to the Tudor line. She was imprisoned for nearly 2 decades, branded a traitor, and silenced by execution. Yet her son ascended with barely a drop of resistance. The throne she was killed for passed effortlessly to her bloodline. Her death had not severed her claim. It had crowned it. But history would not let Mary rest easily. She became a symbol twisted by time, reborn again and again, depending on who told her story. To Catholics, she was a saintly martyr, unjustly executed by heretics. To Protestants, a scheming seductress who invited her own ruin. To Romantics, a tragic heroine, doomed by beauty, betrayed by love, and destroyed by politics. Her letters, portraits, and poems were preserved not as evidence of conspiracy, but as artifacts of womanhood under siege. In art, Mary became luminous. In drama, she became divine. In propaganda, she became dangerous. For centuries, her story would be used to warn, inspire, and manipulate. Even Shakespeare, writing under the rule of her son, was careful never to speak her name, though the shadow of Mary haunts many of his queens. Meanwhile, Elizabeth, the queen who survived, remained trapped in her own paradox. She had kept the crown. She had built an empire. But she died alone, childless, and with Mary's son inheriting everything she had protected. One mother was beheaded, one son crowned, one queen destroyed, one dynasty secured. Mary's legacy did not come through policy or armies. It came through endurance, through the son she raised from a distance, the letters she wrote in secret, and the elegance with which she met death. She never ruled with total power. She rarely held control for long. And yet, her image, her bloodline, and her tragedy outlived every man who tried to bury her. Even today, centuries later, we remember not the parliaments that condemned her or the ministers who spied on her. We remember the woman grasping for love, justice, and dignity in a world ruled by suspicion and violence. Her story is not one of perfect virtue or perfect failure. It is the story of a crown too heavy for a child, of a woman raised to rule but never allowed to. And as we step away from the gallows and the throne, one truth remains unshakable: Mary, Queen of Scots, reigned in death more fiercely than she ever did in life, because even centuries later, her voice still whispers through stone corridors and blood-stained scrolls, asking one question: what does it truly mean to wear a crown if you are never allowed to hold it? Mary's death may have ended her breath, but not her presence. In the decades and centuries that followed, her memory refused to be silenced. Across Europe, whispers of her martyrdom grew louder, bleeding into art, literature, and politics. The scaffold at Fotheringhay became not just a site of execution, but a symbol, a monument to the danger of being born royal, female, and inconvenient. Poets romanticized her final moments. Painters captured her sorrowful grace in oils. Catholics invoked her name in prayer. Revolutionaries invoked her downfall as proof that monarchies devour their own. Even Elizabeth, long after the execution, remained haunted. Her famous indecision, her supposed regret, real or staged, lingered in her private writings and public policy. She never signed another death warrant for a fellow royal. Once was enough. But more than her bloodline or her legend, Mary left Behind something else, an unanswered question about power, womanhood, and fate. She had done what was expected of queens. She married, bore an heir, ruled with poise, and tried to navigate the labyrinth of alliances and betrayal that came with her position. But at every turn, the world punished her not for failing, but for existing in a role it was not ready for her to fill. Her downfall wasn't only political, it was existential. In a world dominated by men, governed by suspicion, and driven by religion, Mary's greatest sin was that she remained herself, unyielding, vulnerable, visible. And this made her legacy dangerous, because future queens and empresses would look to her and ask, what can we learn from the woman who tried to rule like a man, feel like a woman, and survive as both? Mary's story became a cautionary tale, not of failure, but of the narrow margins granted to powerful women. How easily love becomes treason, how quickly marriage becomes entrapment, how a signature, a letter, or a glance can rewrite destiny when you wear a crown. Even the rituals of monarchy shifted in her wake. Future rulers approached queenship with greater caution, understanding that visibility could mean vulnerability. And yet, in some ways, Mary paved a path forward. Her survival instincts, her political charm, and her cultural resonance inspired a new kind of female authority. The very tools once used to shame her, her letters, her liaisons, her tears, were reclaimed over time as signs of complexity, not weakness. Today, historians dig not just through state records and battle plans, but through Mary's own words, written in the slanted hand of a woman grasping for legacy in the dark, because what she left behind was more than a tragic story. It was a living archive of the impossible choices women in power have always faced: to submit or resist, to marry or lead, to speak or be spoken for. Mary chose to speak, and for that, history never buried her. But perhaps the most unsettling echo is this: the very empire that executed her is the one her son inherited. The very throne that feared her voice became the one her blood would claim. The very England that silenced her would one day call her family. In Mary's death, the old world gasped, but the new world listened. Because in every crown worn since by queens of empire, leaders of nations, and daughters of revolution, there is a trace of Mary Stuart's shadow. And that shadow isn't one of failure. It's a warning that a woman with a crown is never just a queen. She is a question the world still struggles to answer. There's something terrifying about legacy. It does not die when the heart stops beating. It lives in whispers, portraits, and the still-burning arguments of historians. It lingers not as flesh, but as an echo. And in the case of Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, Queen of France, nearly Queen of England, her legacy became a mirror, one that queens across centuries would be forced to look into. Because Mary's story is not just about politics or power. It is about transformation, about what happens when a person becomes a symbol, when a girl crowned in infancy is told she was born to rule, but is never given the space to grow, when every decision is judged not by wisdom or context, but by gender, by lineage, by threat. Her blood was royal, her voice is poetic, her tragedy is operatic. But the world didn't mourn her for who she was. It molded her into what it needed. To Catholics, she became a saintly martyr. Her crimson dress at the scaffold was recast as a holy shroud, her prayers as divine testimony. In Catholic strongholds like Spain, she was invoked as a justification for war. A spiritual queen executed by a heretic regime, statues were raised in her memory. Priests spoke her name in sermons, and in some places, women prayed to her like a saint, not canonized by Rome, but by grief. To Protestants, she was something else entirely: a dangerous reminder of a world ruled by Rome and whispers. A woman who brought instability wherever she walked. Her downfall was proof that divine monarchy could not save someone from corruption or chaos. They saw her not as a queen betrayed, but as a monarch unworthy. And yet, even among her enemies, fascination never faded. Elizabeth I, the very woman who signed her death warrant, could not escape Mary's shadow. Elizabeth died childless, unmarried, and alone. Her final years were marked by silence, regret, and an empire she could no longer hold in her hands. Meanwhile, Mary's son ruled both England and Scotland, and Mary's bloodline endured in every monarch that followed. The irony was not lost on anyone. Mary's voice had been extinguished, but her genes ruled from the throne. This bloodline, passed through scandal and execution, would eventually birth kings and queens who sat atop empires. From James I came Charles I, then Charles II, and onward into the House of Hanover, and later the House of Windsor, the modern monarchy of Britain today, Queen Elizabeth II, whose reign lasted into the 21st century, carried Mary's blood. So, does King Charles III? It means that in every coin stamped, in every royal wedding televised, in every wave from a palace balcony, Mary is still there unseen, but never absent. A woman who died for a crown that her descendants would wear. But her influence stretches beyond blood. Mary's life redefined how monarchy, femininity, and fear intertwine. She showed that a queen could be both adored and despised, strong and vulnerable, guilty and framed. She showed that the court of public opinion was often more dangerous than any battlefield. For women in power, perfection is not protection. She loved unwisely. She trusted the wrong men. She underestimated the venom of envy and overestimated the strength of loyalty. But she also endured, through exile, scandal, betrayal, imprisonment, and ultimately execution. She never renounced who she was. She never claimed to be perfect, but she demanded to be heard, even at the scaffold. She took control of her narrative. She chose her final words. She dressed for defiance. And when the axe fell, it did not kill her story. It only made it harder to forget. Historians still argue over her choices. Was she foolish to marry Darnley? Was her alliance with Bothwell coerced or strategic? Did she know about the Babington plot? Or was she lured into it by Walsingham's web? We will never know. Every detail. The records are biased. The letters were edited. The witnesses are long dead. But the uncertainty only adds to her myth. She is not remembered because she was flawless. She is remembered because she was human, and her humanity was punished. In her vulnerability, she became immortal. Today we see her name carved into the walls of history books and screenplays. Her image flickers in films and series, often cast with elegance, tragedy, or fire. She has been portrayed as a saint, a sinner, a victim, and a seductress. But the real Mary was all of them and none of them. She was a queen shaped by fire, by faith, by betrayal, and by blood. And perhaps that is why her story endures. Because we are still terrified of what happens when a woman wears power publicly. Still unsure of what justice looks like when queens are judged for being human. Still wrestling with the idea that the crown, for all its glory, is also a prison. Mary, Queen of Scots, never truly ruled in peace, but she reigns in memory. Her life is not a warning. It is a mirror held up to every throne that asks not who sits upon it, but what will it cost them to stay. And when you look into that mirror, you will not see just a crown. You will see a young girl with fire in her eyes, blood on her lips, and a kingdom too heavy to hold. She was crowned at 9. She was executed at 44. But in between, she was not a mistake. She was a lesson, one we're still learning.